Islam in Africa. A brief history. Everything has a story, and every story has a beginning. The story of how Islam came to dominate massive territory in Africa is complicated. To try and generalize would be a disservice to the reader and historically inaccurate. Below are the major periods that summarize critical moments in Islam's interaction with the continent and the people of Africa. In no way is this the full story, but rather an attempt to explain significant points in time where Islam and Africa's stories overlap. The first Hijrah. During the 7th century, Islam made its first transcontinental journey from Asia to Africa. According to oral tradition, this first voyage, called the first Hijrah or migration, was made by refugees who were fleeing persecution in the Arab Peninsula. However, it was not long afterward that the feet of soldiers, not refugees, marked Islam's more permanent entrance and later conquest of the northern part of the continent. Soon after the death of Muhammad in 639, and during the reign of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Muslim Arab general Amr ibn al-Asi began a military campaign in Egypt. Egypt was conquered quickly, and in 642 Libya fell into Islamic hands as well. By 681, under the Umayyad dynasty, there were successful military campaigns in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. From this control of North Africa, Islam was able to establish a base from which to cross into Europe in 711. The strategic value of controlling North Africa cannot be overstated, as it provided the launching point to further conquest by a religion seeking to spread its global influence. On another note, during this initial conquest, Islam's quick and violent entrance onto the continent effectively ended Christianity in Africa for several centuries. From militants to merchants, Islam's advance gained speed. Following their more violent beginning, Islam continued to spread throughout the African continent through other means. After conquest, Islam spread most rapidly through commerce. As the majority of Berbers now practiced Islam, either through conversion or coercion, they carried this newfound faith along their long-established trade routes. In the 8th century, these trade routes crisscrossed much of West Africa and moved from the east coast into the interior of Central Africa, finally reaching Lake Chad. Islam also continued to spread south from Egypt through the Sudan region along the eastern shores of the Swahili coast. By the 12th century, Islam had reached as far south as Mozambique. Islam spread along the Swahili coast with relative ease as Muslim traders from Arabia and Egypt began to permanently settle in towns and trading centers along the coast. The local Bantu peoples and Arabs mixed, as did their languages, with intermarrying being common, and a blending of cultural practices which led to the evolution of a unique Swahili culture. The Muslim religion ultimately became one of the central elements of Swahili identity. This period of massive expansion was aided by the consolidation of Muslim trading networks, which were connected by lineage, trade, and Sufi brotherhoods. Being a Muslim in Africa meant profit in the marketplace and power in the political realm. The spread of Islam in Africa cannot be characterized as strictly jihad, but it is also not without a violent and bloody history. While economic factors seem to be the main driver of the proliferation of Islam, there were also periods of militant campaigns. Islamic spread in West Africa. As Islam was spreading through the trade routes, they were enveloping entire West African kingdoms along the way. The rulers of these kingdoms ranged from tolerance to full-on acceptance, opening the door for widespread adoption of Islam as the official religion of the kingdom. Islam, from its beginning in West Africa, was very accommodating of an animistic worldview leading to syncretism. Islam seemed able to, for the most part, absorb the older faith into the new one, creating what is known as folk Islam. Islam began its control on West African empires by taking Gao in 985. The Ghana Empire, then 5 centuries old, was next to fall into the hands of Islamic control just a few years later. From there, the religion spread quickly and widely, taking control of the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. By the end of the 14th century, the rulers of the kingdom of Kanem, modern-day Lake Chad region, and Hausa land had adopted Islam, making the encirclement of Africa below the Sahara Desert complete. To generalize the rulers and peoples of this period is difficult. Many embraced Islam wholeheartedly and converted to the religion. However, to say this was the majority or even the norm is uncertain, as there were many African leaders who recognized that adopting Islam would be beneficial to trade. This is not shocking or even new to the religion's roots. Islam was a religion born in the commercial society of Mecca and preached by a prophet who himself had for a long time been a merchant. Both the religion and its founder provide a set of ethical and practical prescripts closely related to business activities. The moral code helped to sanction and control commercial relationships and offered a unifying ideology among the members of different ethnic groups, thus providing for security and credit, two of the chief requirements of long-distance trade. It is no wonder, then, why the most actively commercial peoples of Africa, the Diula, Hausa, and Yakanka, were among the first to embrace Islam and carry it along their routes. This diversity of response is especially highlighted in West Africa. For example, there are no accounts of the Ghanaian kings in the Ghana Empire converting to Islam. Instead, their response appears to be one of tolerance that must be assumed was necessary for survival in the marketplace. This is not to say there were no converts to Islam, but rather to point out that Islam's advance in Africa is a complex matter. The 11th century Ghanaian capital of Kumbi Saleh is a good illustration of this fact. The capital was divided into two distinct towns. One town had 12 mosques, while the other, only 10 kilometers away, contained no mosques, other than one built for visiting merchants, but rather was full of traditional cult shrines. Just a bit north, however, was a different story. The Mali Empire, 13th century, and Songhai Empire, 15th century, seem to have embraced Islam much more wholeheartedly. This is likely because their kings made pilgrimages to Mecca. Oftentimes, they would bring back Muslim scholars, architects, and books. Through this more thorough Islamization of the culture, Africans became influencers and contributors to global Islam. A distinctly Islamic African architecture was birthed, and African Islamic scholars and clerics arose. Great mosques, Quranic schools, and Islamic universities were constructed across these kingdoms and gained international reputations. In this way, Islam was quickly losing its foreignness in Africa. Resistance to Islam. Islam swept through North and West Africa with speed and relative ease. Even along the eastern coast, Islam seemed to move effortlessly through peoples and places. As already mentioned, even those who did not convert to Islam saw the financial and political benefits of at least tolerating the new religion. However, this was not the case in more inland East Africa. There, Islam faced stiff competition from Christianity, which was firmly entrenched in Nubia, Sudan region. Christianity had reached this area by the end of the 1st century, where it greatly developed under the influence of the Eastern Roman Empire. By 580, Christianity had become the official religion of northern Sudan, centered around the Faras Cathedral. Christianity also had a stronghold in modern-day Ethiopia during the Kingdom of Aksum, 1st to 8th century. These areas were able to fend off Muslim conquest and influence until military intervention in the 14th century from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Once the Christian influence was defeated, these kingdoms became yet more bases of Islamic dominance on the continent, as two important Muslim states were established with the sultanates of Adal and Ajuran. Other pockets of resistance and challenges to Islamic expansion also arose elsewhere. One notable people group, being the Mossi who controlled the lands south of the Niger River. Besides simply resisting Islamic influence, they went on the offensive, even attacking and conquering the fabled city of Timbuktu in 1477. However, when Askia Muhammad I became the leader of the Songhai Empire with the desire to spread Islam, he waged a holy war against the Mossi kingdoms in 1497. Although the Mossi forces were defeated in this effort, they still managed to resist attempts to impose Islam. The arrival of Christian missionaries from Europe and later America also led to a slowing down of the advancement of Islam in Africa, especially along the western coast of African states like the Kingdom of Congo. Islamic domination of the Swahili coast was also regularly challenged. Sometimes the fighting was not against some foreign army or traditional king, but rather Islamic infighting, as different sects and streams of Islamic doctrine vied for ideological control. In 1802, in modern-day Nigeria, Uthman Danfodio was a religious teacher and ethnic Fulani herder who launched jihad to purify Islam. His was the first in a series of holy wars to rage across the center of the continent during the 9th century and into the early 20th century. Most of these jihads began as religious rebellions within Islam, uprisings against African kings whom the Sufi reformers believed had corrupted the faith. Yet time and again, as Europe's Christian colonial powers arrived in Africa, these holy wars morphed into battles against the infidel West. These jihads, while largely forgotten, represent some of the earliest and bloodiest confrontations of Islam with the West. They drove colonial policy toward Muslims not only in Africa but worldwide. They also laid the groundwork for Islam's opposition to the modern West. By 1810, 75 years before the British would call Nigeria their colony, Danfodio's army had conquered a large area of West Africa as their own Islamic empire. Their conquest was sweeping in both its range and its speed. However, their conquest was resisted and ultimately halted by a least expected enemy, the tsetse fly. As Danfodio's military, mounted on horses and camels, crossed the 10th parallel, the desert air moistened and the ground grew wetter. Here, the notorious tsetse fly belt began, and sleeping sickness killed off the jihadis' horses and camels, effectively halting their religion's southward advance. Halting the spread of Islam in Africa became a focus for evangelical Christian missionaries in the early 20th century. The German missionary Hermann Kumm and his wife Lucy built a handful of grass huts to serve as a station for their new organization, the Sudan United Mission, along the same 10th parallel where the tsetse fly had stopped Danfodi's cavalry a century before. At the World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh, Scotland in June 1910, some 1,200 Protestant missionaries gathered to chart the greatest crisis Christianity was facing. Many argued that the most pressing challenge to their faith in the world's future was Islam. John Mott, the founder of YMCA, spoke at the conference and later wrote in his book, The Decisive Hour of Christian Missions. Two forces are contending for Africa, Christianity and Mohammedanism, Islam. In many respects, the more aggressive is Mohammedanism. It dominates Africa on its western half as far south as 10 degrees north latitude, and on its eastern half as far south as 5 degrees north. If things continue as they are now tending, Africa may become a Mohammedan continent. Islam has indeed continued to grow in Africa, first through military conquest, then through the market, and most recently through migration. This most recent wave of Islamic growth did not happen until the second half of the 9th century when the British brought their labor force from India, including Muslim Indian nationals, to their colonies in Africa. Today, there are 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa with Muslim majority populations: Niger, 98.3%, Senegal, 96.1%, Gambia, 95.7%, Mali, 95%, Guinea, 89.1%, Sierra Leone 78.6%, and Burkina Faso 61.5%. However, almost every country in sub-Saharan Africa has a growing Muslim population. In 2020, there were 311 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, making up 30.3% of the total population. This means sub-Saharan Africa is home to roughly 16% of the global Muslim population. Nigeria has the fifth highest population of Muslims worldwide and is first in Africa. The spread of Islam has been wide, but it has also been deep. A new way of life. The spread of Islam was made possible through initial military conquests and capitalizing on existing trade routes. The conversion of key peoples who were the main merchants of their day led to a religion that could spread rapidly and cross borders with ease. Islam has continued to grow to this day through the migration of peoples. One interesting thing to note is that after these initial conquests and conversions, Islam appears to have leveled off insofar as rapid growth is concerned. This is especially obvious when compared to Christianity. In 1900, Muslims made up 14% of the total population of sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Christians made up 9%. By 2010, Muslims now made up 29% of the total population of sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Christians were an astounding 57%. There is a myriad of factors for these numbers, but a few observations can be made. First, the 20th century witnessed an unparalleled focus on Christian missions, and Africa was a key field for missionary engagement. This missionary zeal led to the conversion of primarily animistic peoples, seen by their drastic drop from 76% of the total population in 1900 to just 13% in 2010. Islam's slower but steady growth appears to be more consistent with the natural growth and migration of peoples. In other words, regarding growing their respective religions, the strategy of the 20th century appears to be procreation for the Muslim and proselytization for the Christian. That is obviously an overgeneralized statement, but the fact remains that neither religion seemed to gain much ground by converting adherents from the other's faith. Instead, after the 9th century, it appears that Islamic majority peoples remained Islamic and non-Islamic peoples saw large numbers convert to Christianity. The main point to be noted here is that Christianity's rapid growth in Africa did not come through seeing Muslims won to Christ. In the 21st century, many Africans see their religious affiliation as part of their family or people's heritage. The vast majority of the continent contains Muslims and Christians living rather peacefully with one another, in the same country, village, and sometimes family. In West Africa, there are a myriad of mixed families where the husband is Muslim and the wife Christian, or vice versa. These dynamics do not seem to cause major rifts in the family and point to a deeper reality at work. Religious affiliation seems to be inherited more than chosen. A study revealed that neither Christianity nor Islam is growing significantly in sub-Saharan Africa at the expense of the other. There is virtually no net change in either direction through religious switching. Whether for fear of stirring up strife and conflict or a deeper worldview thought that X people are always Muslim and Y people are always Christian, cross-proselytizing does not seem to be happening very often in Africa. In Niger, even top denominational leadership encourages Christians to live at peace with their Muslim neighbors. Unfortunately, living in peace often means not sharing your faith. While this is certainly an issue that must be addressed within Christianity, it is not problematic in Islam. In Christianity, one must individually repent and believe in Christ. In Islam, there is the expectation that you are born Muslim and therefore will remain Muslim. Understanding Islam itself and its history in Africa can help explain some of this reality. To be a Songhai is to be Muslim. This is a statement uttered and believed by the vast majority of the Songhai people of West Africa and is the same sentiment expressed by myriad people groups across the continent. The people have been non-Muslim for as far back as they can remember, to the point that it is unthinkable to consider oneself otherwise. A Songhai is simply born a Muslim, and to call him or her to anything else would be like asking them to not be a Songhai person. This sort of thinking goes back to the Islamic entrance into Africa. As already mentioned, the 8th to the 15th centuries saw entire kingdoms and regions converted to Islam in a relatively short period. This means that today, many peoples have been Islamic since less than a century after Muhammad's death. In other words, Africans have been Muslims for almost as long as anyone in the world. From the beginning, native converts studied and became scholars, missionaries, and even saints. And so, Islam came to be seen no longer as a foreign religion but as a black African one. Africans forget that there was a time before Islam. They tend to forget that North Africa was a bastion of Christian scholarship long before Islam came ashore. Unfortunately, due to the missionary movement of the 20th century, Christianity is often seen as a new arrival at best and a white man's religion at worst. In these ways and more, Christianity struggles to shake its foreignness. People either embraced Islam wholeheartedly or rejected it wholeheartedly. These people groups were often already divided before Islam came. For instance, there has always been conflict between animal herders and farmers over land disputes. In places like Nigeria, the herders are largely Muslim and the Christians largely farmers. Much of the current conflict and even current terrorism activity in northern Nigeria has more to do with these land disputes than religious convictions. It is too easy to label this a religious battle, which both parties often try to exploit, when the reality is much more complex. Religion gets blamed and named for ethnic, social, and political frustrations that are centuries old. A stone left unturned. Beyond the history, though, there are other reasons for Islam's stronghold on lives. Perhaps the most important observation is that Islam is not only a religion. Instead, it is a comprehensive way of life, catering to all the fields of human existence. Islam guides all aspects of life, individual and social, material and moral, economic and political, legal and cultural, national and international. You simply cannot tease out religion from culture. In Islam, they're interconnected. Islam brought with it a culture of its own, including dress and language. There are not large efforts to indigenize Islam into the culture, but rather to Islamize the culture. This has led to another reason that Islam remains so entrenched in certain peoples. While it seems counterintuitive that a culture dominating one's life like Islam would leave any stone unturned, they have, it appears, left a huge one untouched. That stone is traditional religion. From its inception in Africa, Islam has in large part allowed animistic traditions and practices and beliefs to remain with little to no conflict. Some scholars have even argued that Islam is a traditional African religion. Much ink has been spilled distinguishing what is known as folk Islam, a syncretistic faith where Islam and traditional African religion combine, and Orthodox Islam. However, as Phil Parshall and Rick Love helpfully point out, with a large majority, over 70%, of global Muslims and closer to 95% of African Muslims practicing folk Islam, then folk Islam, for all intents and purposes, is Orthodox Islam. Islam focuses on external conformation, whereas Christianity focuses on internal transformation. This does not mean Christians in Africa have not also fallen prey to syncretism. What it means instead is that Islam much more naturally welcomes a dual allegiance. In Niger, there is no problem and no contradiction noted when someone walks right out of the Friday mosque to attend a spirit possession ceremony. This focus on rituals and outward appearances while leaving the heart untouched has left a vast majority of African Muslims unsure what their religion or their holy book even teaches. The strategy of dominating certain aspects of culture, dress, routine, language, while leaving alone other aspects, worldview, and beliefs, has left millions of people who look and talk and behave like 7th century Arabs, but who believe and make sense of the world like their ancestors. This, along with some of the other factors already mentioned, makes engaging Muslims with the gospel a uniquely challenging task. Islam and the African worldview. While syncretism is rampant and folk Islam is the norm, there is perhaps a deeper reason these two religious systems can coexist so interchangeably. Despite looking very different from the outside, Islam and African traditional religion have many of the same values. When Christianity arrived on the continent, there were large-scale calls for reform, forsaking idol worship, polygamy, and any other cultural norms that were contra-biblical were all expectations for the new convert to Christ. However, this was not the case in Islam, which was much more compatible and accepting of almost all these practices. Islam is very much in agreement that there is an unseen spiritual realm affecting everything from travel to pregnancy. While Allah is largely uninvolved with his creation, much like the god of deism, Satan, demons, witches, jinn, and the like are running amok on earth. In all the established pharmacies in Niamey, Niger, with modern medicines from Europe, one can also purchase powders to fight off evil spirits. This bottle of powder is said to have been blessed and produced in the Arab world and endorsed by a well-known Islamic teacher. Another similarity is the ritualistic nature of both faiths. In both Islam and most traditional African faiths, the focus is on the right practice of rituals. Knowing what the Arabic words that are prayed mean or thinking devotionally on them are not on many Muslims' radars. Instead, what is important is their rote repetition in rote positions of prayer. Beyond the actual practices, however, is the goal. While most Muslims would likely say they are trying to cover over wrongs through their prayer and fasting, a deeper look reveals a different motivation. The idea of blessings and curses is very prevalent, and again melds well with traditional beliefs. Spirits and demons must be appeased and manipulated for both prophylactic and therapeutic purposes. Religiosity is less about holy living and more about crop production, posterity, and honor among peers. A final similarity is in the way that both Islam and an African worldview perceive authority. There is the idea of the big man. This big man must be obeyed and even served or worshipped by the common people. He is not to be questioned and his authority is not to be challenged. Islam is more than happy to comply with this worldview. Since the majority of Muslims worldwide do not speak Arabic fluently, their knowledge of their faith and even their holy book is largely dependent on their imam, read big man. Whatever he says goes, no questions asked. Individual thought and reflection are discouraged, and communal conformity is encouraged if not enforced. Why does this matter? With 1/3 of the population of sub-Saharan Africa self-professing Muslims, it would be poor stewardship of the gospel to not pray and plan for engaging Muslims with the gospel. Simply agreeing to live at peace with an "I'll leave you alone if you leave me alone" attitude does not reflect the heart of our Savior and his Great Commission. It is because of this reality that each book in this series will spend significant time helping the reader understand the worldview of his Muslim neighbors even better. Understanding what they believe about God and how they understand salvation will be critically important for effective ministry. This information will also necessarily inform strategies. However, there are some general observations for unique challenges that can be made even now regarding ministry among Muslims. Unique challenges. As already mentioned, most Muslim majority people groups do not remember a time when they were not Muslims. Individuals likely have no conversion event, but rather believe they were born this way and that they cannot change. Another challenge that can also be an opportunity, is the Muslims' understanding of community, ummah. There is a natural brotherhood, generally across the world and specifically in their local context. To leave this community is almost unthinkable and comes with a price. In places where Sharia law is established, it can cost someone their life. But even in secularly governed countries, to leave the ummah of Islam is to commit cultural suicide. Therefore, strategies must point to a new and real community that the convert will be welcomed into. Muslims do not live compartmentalized lives as so many Christians do, who think little of Christ outside of Sunday. They must be shown a real community exists on the other side of conversion that touches and interprets every part of their day and every activity. Laying down our Christian culture, reaching Muslims will call for evangelism, discipleship, and church planting strategies that are different than those most familiar to the reader. It will require learning new skills and trying new strategies than those that are effective among animistic or even nominal Christians. For example, large crusades and street preaching are typically not as effective as dialogue with a small group. A come and see model is largely ineffective. Another challenge to evangelism is that because Islam is not contextualized, a large number of Muslims do not know what they truly believe, but rather rely totally on their imam. When engaging with the gospel, terms like Son of God, prayer, salvation, and even heaven must be carefully explained. Short and pithy, gospel presentations might sow the first seed, but likely much more explanation will be necessary. Also, the kind of church that will be welcoming to Muslims, both seekers and believers, will be very different than those who grew up in a church culture. Certain elements that are common in a Christian culture church, men and women sitting together, dancing, shouting, drums, will be misunderstood at best and seen as blasphemous at worst among most Muslims. Engaging Muslims with the gospel has historically erred in two directions. First are those who require Muslims to become like me. This approach means cultural suicide for the convert as they give up everything culture-wise to follow Christ. All disciples count the cost to follow Jesus, and everyone will inherently lose certain things when they come to Christ. However, no one should have to give up their culture just to enter someone else's culture. Instead, everyone should weigh and view their culture through the lens of the Bible and be willing to lose anything that does not line up. Christianity can cross any culture. A Fulani should not have to become a Yoruba to follow Jesus. Yes, they must be willing to and should rid themselves of any cultural practice or belief that is clearly unbiblical. But there is much freedom in the expression of the church and worship for the new believer. The other error has typically been remain like you. Now, there are no calls for losing any aspect of culture. Some proponents of this strategy would even say it is not necessary to call the new convert a Christian, but rather to continue to self-identify as Muslim. Whereas the first approach was an under-contextualized model, this is an over-contextualized model. The goal of missions is to develop strategies that are biblically faithful and culturally appropriate. We do not force anyone to become like us, but we cannot allow anyone, including ourselves, to remain as they are. Conclusion. Thinking deeply about ministering to Muslims is one of the goals of this series. The desire is to equip church leaders and church members to understand, love, and engage their Muslim neighbors with the gospel. In doing so, Africans will return to some of their most ancient roots and follow in the footsteps of their oldest ancestors.